from the military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday morning, well, Tuesday morning West Coast time, 10 a.m., 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we talk about military history, military doctrine, the leadership of great military people, all by way of distilling from that lessons that we can use in our business and professional lives. So today I'm going to look at a topic that was part of my career. So as a chaplain in the United States Navy, I had the benefit, I guess, or I don't exactly know what to call it, but I had the opportunity, I guess, to work in a lot of different communities. So my first tour of duty was with the Marine Corps. My second one was with Naval Aviation. And then I went into the reserves and went back on active duty in submarines, and then went off of active duty back to the reserves, and then went on back to active duty again with Naval Aviation. And during my career, I did a shipboard deployment, so I was part of what's known as the Black Shoe Navy. Those are the ship drivers, the sort of what we think of as the Navy, the people who operate ships, and also spent a little bit of time around Seabees. That's the Naval Construction Battalion, and as well. So it gave me an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast how these different communities operate. And one of the things that I found most striking is in comparing the submarine community to the aviation community. So in both cases, the fundamental unit size, a squadron and a submarine, are about the same size. Now, I should mention I was involved with what are called fast attack boats. These are small submarines that do tactical and operational missions, gathering intelligence, that sort of thing. Okay, there's another type of submarines. They're much larger than the fast attack boats. In fact, they're roughly the size of a destroyer, but they're underwater. We call them, in the submarine community, they're called the boomers. They're nuclear armed submarines, and generally speaking, they're a strategic asset. They'll go out on an 89-day cruise and stay underwater essentially the whole time, so that the enemy doesn't know where these nuclear missiles are. So I mean, I got to be on a boomer one time that pulled into port at Point Loma, where I was stationed. But my time was primarily with the fast attack boats, and they have a fairly small crew, a little over 120. Well, they were all men at the time. And aviation too is a relatively small unit, couple of hundred people at the most. They're very tight knit units. They have, generally speaking, very high esprit de corps, and there is a lot of communication and sharing of information at all levels. So whereas in an infantry unit, rarely would a private first class infantryman be talking to the colonel or the lieutenant colonel who's in charge of the battalion. On a submarine, it's not unusual for a seaman, who is pretty much that's the lowest enlisted level that you'll find on a submarine, to talk to the captain of the boat, who's a commander. That's the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel. And the same thing is true in an aviation squadron. So you can have a plane captain, which is oftentimes the first job that a sailor will have going into a squadron. Plane captain could be, literally 18 years old. And that plane captain can talk to the squadron commander, who again is a commander, an 05. So there's a lot of that interaction. Nonetheless, the way the leadership, and when I say the leadership, what I mean is the top leadership in those two communities is very different. And so I want to explore that with you today by way of looking at two, what I call paradigms, or two models for how you can deal with choosing successors in your business. So, as always, I put together a little PowerPoint presentation. And there we go, two paradigms, I'm not sure, for choosing successors. So here we go. For those of you who are frequent watchers of the show, you know this already. All the Way to Wow shows are based on the 3 pillars of attainment. On this show, we deal primarily with the finances realm of the pursuits pillar, but oftentimes we'll at least touch on relationships, and certainly the friends and colleagues realm is going to be relevant here. All right, so first I want to look at, generally speaking, when we're looking for a successor in our business, what do we have to consider? Okay, and I identified basically 4 primary issues. So the needs of the business. We need to have an outline of the role, i.e., what is the person going to be doing. We need to identify and evaluate candidates. And then we need, whoever is chosen, we need to develop and transition. We need to develop that person and transition the person into the role. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. I think these are pretty much self-evident, but certain businesses need different types of leaders. So if you are in a consumer business, whether it's clothing or whether it's food, so that business probably needs a different type of leader than, say, a highly technical business like an aircraft manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company. Okay, so someone in those technical businesses, or more technically oriented businesses, they need to be able to understand what the technology of the business is about. There's a much greater role for that. Whereas in a consumer business, while there's still going to be technology, the primary business of that company is not technology, it's clothing, food, whatever. The technology comes into play in terms of how the business operates, but it's not what the business is about. So that's just one example of differing needs that businesses differing needs that businesses have. Okay, so then outlining the role. So I'm going to be talking primarily about the very top of the pyramid, if you will, in a business. The CEO, the COO. In the military, the CEO would generally equate to what we call a commanding officer. Okay, that's the person who is responsible for everything that happens in that unit. Now, if you go back and look at the show I did, I don't know, I think it was, was it last week or 2 ago? I talked a little bit about how I talked about how the Army organizes its units, and we started. The highest was a division, which is commanded by typically a major general. So in that case, the commanding officer is a major general, because the size of a division, which has, as I recall, maybe 10 to 15,000 soldiers in it. Okay, but if you go down from there to, say, a brigade, so a brigade may have, say, 5,000 soldiers in it. So the commanding officer there might be a brigadier general. Okay, and then below that, you might have a battalion. There used to be something called a regiment. That doesn't apply anymore. But a battalion, and the battalion commander typically will be a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, something like that. By the way, a brigade commander could also be a colonel. It just depends on the size and those sort of things. So So the commanding officer is the person at the sort of top of whatever the unit is, and in a business we would generally call that the CEO. That's much more common. When I was a kid growing up, you never heard that term. President, generally speaking, was who ran a company. And then the next person down in a military unit is generally speaking called an executive officer. And the executive officer is someone who oversees the day-to-day operations of the unit. Generally speaking, they're one grade below the commanding officer's grade, although not always. So you could have a division where the CO is a major general, a two-star general. The executive officer typically would be a one-star general, a brigadier general, but it might be a colonel. Again, it depends on the circumstances, especially if you're talking in wartime where there are fatalities. So it could have been that the XO was a one-star general and he's wounded or killed, so he can no longer fill the role. And so they bring up a colonel to fill that role because that's what you have available or something like that. So in the business world, of course, we call that the COO, the Chief Operating Officer. And generally speaking, the Chief Operating Officer is responsible for day-to-day operations of the business, while the CEO deals with things like strategy and the sort of top line stuff, dealing with the board of directors, et cetera. Okay, so that's really what I'm talking about here. Although I think you could apply this in other places in the business. So, for example, let's take a restaurant. So a typical restaurant will have a manager and an assistant manager, and then there'll be some kind of regional manager, and then there might be and even another division before you get to kind of national, right? So in terms of the manager and assistant manager of the restaurant, I think this could apply to that as well. Okay, so and again, retail store, manager, assistant manager, retail store. Okay, so while I'm going to be talking more from the CEO, COO perspective, again, you can apply it to others. So outline the role. So what is the person going to have to do? And this will grow out of the needs of the business. So if the business is heavily technology oriented, and so then the CEO has to be able to understand the technology in order to be able to steer the enterprise. So, outlining the role requires a technical background. In technical businesses too, especially a technical business where you deal with very large clients and orders. So let's take an aviation company. Let's Bombardier. Okay, so while Bombardier may sell, a one-off order, oftentimes Bombardier is selling a group of aircraft to an airline, and so in that case, the CEO may be involved in sales to these large customers. Okay, that same would be true of Boeing or Airbus, right? You see orders for aircraft, 100 planes, 200-300 planes, right? Inevitably, the CEO is going to be involved in dealing with orders of that size, where we're talking about, tens of billions of dollars at stake, maybe more, maybe, $100 billion, something like that. Okay, so, as opposed to, a restaurant CEO where he's not going to be selling, anything to anybody most of the time, unless the business itself is being sold. So we need to look at what are the functions within the role. Okay. Identify and evaluate candidates. I think that's pretty much self-explanatory. And then develop and transition. So how do we make sure that the chosen candidate is ready to step into that next role, or ready to step into the role, and how do we make that transition from the existing leader to the new one? Okay, all right, so with that as a background, then let's look at the two paradigms. So in aviation, the way it works is you have what's called a competitive selection for command. Okay, and what that means is Once a commander, a Navy commander, and I'm talking about naval aviation, by the way, so I can't tell you how it works in the Air Force, frankly. But in the Navy, once a commander in the aviation community is eligible for command, so they'll do what's called, they'll screen for command. Okay, and what that means is they go before a screening board who interviews them. It's not unlike a meeting to discuss a job, or what we call a job interview, or a lot of people call it that. Okay, and that board will then select them for command. Okay, now you have the same thing in the submarines community. Okay, so you have a competitive selection. But in the case of submarines, you have separate competitive selection for the CO and for the XO. Okay, the CO, commanding officer, XO, executive officer. So on a submarine, the commanding officer, generally speaking, will be a commander. The XO will be a lieutenant commander. Okay, and in an aviation squadron, once you screen for command, what happens is you start out as an executive officer. In fact, what you really start out as what's called a PXO, a prospective executive officer. So you'll go to the squadron while the CO and XO, the current CO and XO are still there. Okay, and you become the PXO, the prospective executive officer. And then when the commanding officer completes his command tour, usually it's around 18 months, he leaves the squadron. The XO now fleets up, meaning he takes over that job as commanding officer, and the PXO becomes the executive officer. That's what we call fleeting up in the Navy. It means you're sitting in a subordinate role for a period of time until you take over the next role up. Okay? Now, why do aviation and submarines have these different systems? Well, from viewing it from a chaplain's perspective, and all I do as a chaplain is deal with people, right? I don't get to fly. I did get to steer the submarine once. It was a freaky thing to steer in 3 dimensions. Okay, just so you know, I was what's called under instruction, meaning a very experienced helmsman was sitting right behind me, telling me what to do. Okay, so there was no danger to the submarine at any time that I was steering it. But what I observe is, while, of course, both aviation and submarines are very technologically oriented communities, in aviation, maintaining the culture of aviation is critical to squadrons being able to do what they do. So they have oftentimes a very, very robust operational tempo. It's called an ops tempo, especially when they're deployed. Oftentimes they're flying every day. In fact, it's when we have what's called a no-fly day on the carrier, right, where no aircraft are launching and being recovered. That's somewhat of a misnomer, because, for example, we would have no-fly days, and in fact, our fixed-wing aircraft would not fly, but our helicopters still flew on no-fly days. In fact, when I would see my helo guys on a no-fly day, they go, "Sir, I thought this was a no-fly day. How come I have to suit up?" And, I mean, they meant it as a joke, of course. But maintaining that culture in order to keep that op tempo going and keep the people able to operate is the critical factor. Whereas in submarines, even the fast attack boats, these are nuclear powered submarines. They're carrying a reactor on the boat. Okay? Virtually everyone on that submarine is a nuclear qualified sailor, from the captain all the way on down to, the guys the most junior sailor who's working in a boat maintenance or something like that. Now there are a few people on the boat, like the sailors who prepare the food, and the what's called the independent corpsman, who's there to take care of the health and deal with injuries. They're not nuclear qualified, but probably 90% of the people on a submarine are nuclear qualified, because when all is said and done, making sure that boat is properly maintained is crucial, especially the reactor. And I'll tell you, one of the scariest things that ever happened to me when I was in the Navy was when I was on a submarine. We were underwater, and I'm laying in my rack. That's Navy term for bed, and an alarm goes off, and it turns out there was a fire on the boat. Fire on a nuclear submarine, right? And we're told, if you are not part of the damage control team, get out of the way, stay where you are, right? And I laid there in bed until finally the announcement was made that everything was safe. But that technical skill was the most important thing. And so the amount of technical skill that you need to be an XO is not as high as the amount of technical skill you need to be a CO. It has to constantly be increasing until you get to that CO's job. And so that's why there are individual selections for XO and CO. Okay, so you can see two different paradigms there for dealing with choosing a successor. So let's just kind of go through some of these other things real quickly. So I talked about needs of the business, right? Strengths, weaknesses, growth opportunities, future vision, right? You can see how one paradigm or the other would deal with these differently. Okay, so in the case of naval aviation, strengths and weaknesses are already pretty much sussed out at the time that someone screens for command. Whereas in submarines, the leadership is going to get an opportunity to suss out the strengths and weaknesses of an XO and then screen him again before he's going to actually command a submarine, to make sure that he has what he needs to be a commanding officer of that submarine. And by the way, I would add to that, rarely is a squadron, an aviation squadron commander, out of touch with higher echelons of control. Whereas on a submarine, once that boat submerges, the captain of the boat, the commanding officer of that boat, he is not in touch with higher echelons of authority. So he's acting on his own authority. So again, the kind of leadership that you need on that submarine is different than what you need for an aviation squadron. Okay. And we talked about, growth opportunities, needs of the business, like how does the business need to grow? What is going to grow the business? Is it more of the technology? Is it more of the sales? What's going to grow the business? What's going to create opportunity? And that may lead you to decide, well, this paradigm is better than this other one. Future vision, same thing. Okay, so then, outlining the role. So I've talked about this quite a bit already: responsibilities, expectations, authority, right? I just mentioned the difference in authority you have between a submarine CO, who's going to act oftentimes on his own counsel, if you will, when the boat is deployed and underwater, whereas an aviation squadron commander, he has a lot of authority, but in the end, he's in fairly constant contact with the air wing commanding officer, who's in contact with the strike group commanding officer, if we're talking about a carrier, right? And so it's a different level of authority and a different ability to exercise that authority. And there's also different expectations then. All right, so all of these, again, how much freedom of action do you need? Are you going to be giving to someone in your business? And if that, freedom of action, so if freedom of action in the, in the top role, is greater because, for example, the board may not always, the board in a particular company may not be as assertive in exercising its authority, so that may mean something different about who you need as a leader. Okay, next. Identify and evaluate candidates. So this would be what we call the screening process. Okay, screening for command. So all of these things become relevant in the Navy, and of course they're all relevant in business as well. Okay, and when you look at these, so internal, external, family, skills and experience, cultural fit, vision and ambition, all of these play into what do you really need for your business. So let's say, for example, your business needs to pivot in another direction. Well, having an internal candidate do that may be difficult. They may be too steeped in the company's culture, in the way it's been doing business, for them to be able to make that big paradigm shift for your business. Okay. On the other hand, if you have a very strong culture that you want to maintain, then promoting from inside may be important as well. And again, you see the same thing in the Navy. So the fact that in an aviation squadron, the XO fleets up to the CO, you're keeping it to a certain extent a much more contiguous culture. In a submarine, when that CO leaves, another CO who has no experience with that boat comes in. Now, that can be good and that can be bad. If the boat is having some troubles, okay, having someone who's loyal to that CO fleet up on a submarine could be bad, because that could perpetuate the problems. And now you've got a nuclear powered submarine out there, right, with problems that aren't getting solved. Whereas if you bring in new blood, you maybe have a better likelihood that the problem will be solved. On the other hand, you could have a boat that's running really smoothly, and it would be great to have the XO fleet up, but because it doesn't work that way, someone new comes in and throws the whole situation into disarray. Okay, because of the nature of dealing with a submarine, I think the Navy has concluded we need to have new eyes on to make sure that things aren't being missed, and that's the most important thing. All right. And then finally, develop and transition. So any leader is going to need proper training and mentorship. In a few weeks, I think I'm going to be talking about how the Marine Corps trains its leaders. It's actually quite a remarkable plan that they have. But training and mentorship needs to take place. There also should be a timeline, okay? So it's not wishy-washy what's happening when, and there needs to be communication to people. Now, in an aviation squadron, it's understood. Once you screen for command and you go to a squadron as a PXO, within a short period of time, you're going to be fleeting up to be the XO. And then you're going to spend roughly 18 months as the XO. And then after that 18 months, the CO is going to leave, and you're going to fleet up to be the CO. You're going to spend 18 months as a CO, and then off you go. In submarines, honestly, I don't recall the term that a CO has. I believe it's 2 years, if memory serves. And then you turn over to a new CO. Now, you try and make sure that there's a turnover period where the existing CO will still be there for a period of time while the new CO, kind of gets his sea legs, so to speak. And so the timelines typically overlap, but sometimes they can't because of the needs of the Navy. People have to, go on to their next job. Okay, and the same questions come up in business. Ideally, you have some overlap. So want to take just the last few minutes here to talk about a couple of examples where we see this successor issue so often. If you follow the Walt Disney Company at all, you know this has been a perennial problem going all the way back to when Walt Disney was the creative head of the company and Roy Disney was the business head of the company. When Walt Disney died, okay, his successor was his son-in-law, and his son-in-law really, frankly, didn't do a great job running the company. And the succession of leaders that happened post Walt Disney were what caused the company to somewhat falter and eventually led to it being bought out, and the creation of what is now called the Walt Disney Company. Before that, it was Walt Disney Productions. And then Eisner, it's not Robert Eisner, Michael Eisner became the CEO of Disney. He was the CEO for a long, long time. And one of the big issues he wrestled with was who was going to take over for him. And finally, he chose a guy by the name of Michael Ovitz, who was one of the biggest talent agents in Hollywood to take over. And Michael Ovitz came in and was there for just a short period of time. It was clear it was not a good fit. And he left the company, again, leaving this successor gap. And eventually, Robert Iger took over, and he ended up being CEO for a long, long time as well. And then a few years ago, Robert Iger left, and a guy by the name of Bob Chapek took over. Chapek lasted for, I think, less than a year, and they brought Iger back. And now, again, one of the big issues for the Walt Disney Company is who's going to succeed Robert Iger. You also see the same thing in Starbucks, where, all of a sudden I went up on the name of the guy. Howard Schultz started the company, left, came back, left, came back. And now the current CEO seems to be doing okay. Time will tell. He hasn't been doing it for that long, I think maybe a year. But you can see two iconic companies where this issue of succession has really been problematic for, you could almost argue, the life of the company, right? So I think it behooves us to think about these issues in our companies to avoid these kind of problems. All right, so here's just, you'll see these links in the show notes if you have any questions, want any help. And then there's the legal stuff. So there we go. I'm just going to close this up and wrap up real, because we're past time already. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this interesting. Hope you find it useful in applying to your businesses. Tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. Hope you'll join me for that. And then we'll start again next week on Monday at 10 a.m. with Trusts and Estates Weekly. So I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. And signing off as I always do, Marie, you're my bell. Thanks so much.